Hey everyone, welcome back to the next episode of The First Gen Psychologist. In this series, we will cover topics that destigmatize mental health, as well as topics for personal development and empowerment centered on the first gen experience. I'm Dr. Lisette, aka the First Gen Psychologist. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I am a first gen Latina psychologist, leadership coach, speaker, writer, and today I'm your host. Today's topic is Unveiling Racial Trauma, from Pain to Empowerment. And we will be learning more about this from the amazing Dr. Brian Rojas Arauz, PhD, who is an Afro-Latino speaker, scholar, activist, and healer. I want to share a little bit more about the amazing Dr. Brian because I also really admire a lot of his work. We actually went to the same doctoral program together. And we were in the same doctoral seminar, which means we shared an advisor. So it's extra special to be collaborating with him today. But let me share a bit more. So Dr. Brian Rojas Arauz, él is a bilingual, bicultural, Afro-Latino immigrant of Costa Rican and Panamanian descent. He spent his teenage years in the Bay Area, California, where he became a community organizer and dream activist. Dr. Rojas Arauz is a bilingual licensed psychologist, author, speaker, and founder of In La Cash Counseling, Education, and Consulting. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead while I'm reading this, share with you all his website so you can see how where you can go. And so where at his practice, he provides trauma responsive and culturally sensitive psychological services, immigration evaluations, trainings, consultations, and speaking engagements. He's also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Denver's International Disaster Psychology, Trauma, and Global Mental Health Master's Program. He is a hip hop educator, slam poet, documentary filmmaker, and a scholar activist. And we are so privileged and honored to have you here with us today. Dr. Rojas Arauz, how are you?
Brian is always good with you, Lisette. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm good. I'm honestly just trying to take this moment in, and how we come in circles. Like you said, we got to be academic siblings, and now we're in our professional lives, and just again feeling a lot of gratitude to be here today.
Thank you so much. And, you know, I think a big value of mine is being in community. And today we're going to be discussing a pretty heavy topic, right? Like in my excitement to educate our communities, like my excitement is around the education and around the spending the time with folks who have this shared mission and values of providing this information for folks. But this is a painful topic to discuss. And so I want to honor that. So if at any moment for folks who are maybe listening in, like take this in moments and the moments that feel good for you. And if it feels like too much, please feel free to step away or to move away from the screen, turn off the screen. And then and similar, I know that you say Brian, but I like this title is new, Dr. Brian. So at least Dr. Brian, you're Dr. Brian to me right now. And we like work so hard for that title. And so but yes, so we're going to go into this Dr. Brian's area of expertise. As you've heard, everything that he's done in his life, in our life, our lived experiences also inform this work that we do. So to begin to provide that education for folks is when we talk about racial trauma, what is that? And how would you say it differs from other forms of trauma?
Yeah, I think the first thing, right, is understanding that racial trauma is directly connected to
Yeah.
identity and experiences of racism. The reality is that when we think of trauma, we usually think of specific, either one time or recurring trauma experiences that could be physical, sexual violence, accidents, and natural disaster, right? Like all these things that happen, and you say, well, this is when it happened. When it comes to racial trauma, it's a little bit more pervasive, right? And we see it kind of like continuously being present, right? But being connected to day-to-day discrimination, systemic racism, microaggressions, hate crimes, biases, all these things that, because of the way the DSM set up, is not always accounted for as trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned DSM, so I'm just going to talk about what that is for folks who maybe are unfamiliar. So DSM is the book that most mental health professionals utilize or are educated on that holds all of the different formal diagnoses for folks. And so when we are working in medical settings or different settings, sometimes we have to provide a diagnosis for what a person's experiencing. Usually it's so that insurance will cover it and all of that. And so that's what, and so it stands for the diagnostic. It's just the diagnostic. Oh my goodness. I don't actually remember what DSM stands for. Something DS diagnostic something manual.
A statistical manual. Yeah.
That's what I thought, but I was having doubts. But yeah, no, absolutely. So that's what that is. And so, yeah, there's a lot that goes into that book that is not inclusive of what the experience is, especially when we're speaking on racial trauma. And something that, you start to share with what it is, how pervasive it can be for folks, and how would you say it impacts individuals on a psychological, emotional, and or physical level?
Yeah, I think the first thing, when we think of a typical trauma, or what the DSM will qualify as post-traumatic stress disorder, we think of an individual's experience. When it comes to racial trauma, it is something that is experienced by a community, right? And it's also chronic. There's usually not this one time it happened, but instead it's a continuation of things that have been happening. And we go back to this space where we question, right? Like, hold on, was that what I thought it was? When it comes to the effects, the impacts, I think first talk about psychological impacts, right? Feeling stress, anxiety, hypervigilance, right? Constantly having to wait for something bad to happen. Like, it's exhausting, right? Like, you're constantly looking over your shoulder, not knowing, and sometimes experiencing things and gaslighting yourself. Like, was that actually racism? Was that actually something negative, right? We do that to ourselves often. We might feel depressed. We might feel hopelessness, right? Like, especially when in our experience might be like, well, this is never going to end. Like, how do I get out of something that I cannot put a stop to? Thirdly, PTSD symptoms, right? So like, there's a lot of things that come with racial trauma, even though we have a harder time sometimes, given that it's a diagnosis by itself, right? You might have all of the same symptoms. Nightmares show up, flashbacks, feeling emotionally distressed, having a hard time emotionally regulating.
Yeah.
Emotionally, I think that things like anger, fear, anxiety, shame, guilt, self-blame, right? Like, sometimes feeling that somehow it's our fault that we're experiencing the world in which we experience it. Grief, sadness. I think some of the clients that I work with go through the stages of grief in relation to understanding their own identities or how these have affected their experience of the world. And lastly, you said physical, and for physical, I'll say things like headaches, right? Stomach issues. I think also thinking of the physiological stress response of our body. So we are constantly activated, right? And when we're feeling stressed, we build cortisol, and when we're building cortisol, it leads to sometimes long-term health issues, right? So chronic conditions, hypertension, diabetes, chronic pain, etc., could be directly connected to this. And depending where we come from, we might show our mental health in different ways, and a lot of times it could be somatically. I guess the last thing I'll say is that they connect to each other, right? Like, it's not just like you're only gonna suffer in psychological or emotional or physical. They all come together and like often feed into one another.
Yeah, no, and that was such a great, concise. It's like as concise as we can when we're talking about what this could look like, because there's so many other ways. And as I was listening to you, Dr. Bryan, I was, oftentimes when I think about this, I often think of my brother. I think of the neighborhoods that we grew up in, and it was home. It was home, and it was familiar, and so. But stepping out of those neighborhoods, the discomfort that we would experience, even now, right? I live in Long Beach. It's this building where there's maybe a lot of older folks. It's Long Beach, I think, is more diverse than the area I was living in before, but just generally, like there's certain, like when my brother comes, there's times where he will feel this hypervigilance, where he will say like, oh, I feel like people look at me and they don't feel that I belong here. Or, and he's just, and I'll sit there and I'm thinking in my mind, I'm like, I don't think that's what's happening, right? Like my immediate internal reaction is, like, no, you're fine. You belong here. I live here. You have every right to be here as much as I do. Like you should be able to take up space here. But the reality is, this uncomfortable stares that he feels in an elevator or as he walks down the hallway or anything, those are also very real. And that part of the racial trauma is that, questioning, is this real or not, right? So I'm sitting there with that. I'm like, no, he should feel like he belongs in this space and that he can take up space here. And he's had enough experiences that I can't discount that feeling that he has, where people may be feeling that in the same way. And so
Mhm.
that's sort of the image that came to mind. And this is one example, but I say my brother, but that could easily be any other like BIPOC person on the street coming into this space, right? And yeah, so I'll pause there, but
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's so real, right? Like how it is hard for us to feel confident in ourselves when
yeah,
we live in a society that puts everything about us into question,
yeah,
right? And when we think of psychologists, right, and doctors, um, people don't often think of our faces, right? And what does that mean when we go into these spaces that are majority white, right? When we think of psychology, it's about 80% white, 76% of it usually female identified, right? So like being a man of color in that space, I definitely connect to your brother's story, right? And it doesn't have to be in Long Beach. Sometimes it's in academia.
mhm,
Sometimes it's in these buildings where we're teaching, right?
yeah,
In places in which we work, right? Agencies where we're serving, like
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, so that experience, it's anywhere you are, right? You may have had the experience in one place, but then that you're carrying that with you into all the other spaces that you go into, right? And that's a lot of, and I was like, we can talk about that for a bit, but you know what I want to transition to is as we're talking about this, and so know that with this question, I am fully aware that first of all, the next question is about systems. I am aware that we are reacting to systems when we talk about this, when we're talking about the racial trauma that people experience. And I also think people deserve to have skills for how do you ground yourself in the moment of the trigger. But I think I want to, my preface is that this is not the solution. This is definitely, I don't even think it's a band-aid. I think it's kind of like sana, like it's okay, trying to feel that community, trying to lean into that. But we'll talk about systems after this.
I love that you dropped that sana sana. It is right. Like we need to be able to take care of ourselves, and the reality is that if we're not able to change the system automatically, right, we're not gonna get it right today. We've been living in this planet for a long time, and we continue to mess up, right? So
Yeah.
odds are tomorrow we get to try again, right? So like thinking through that, having the skills to support yourself was super important. The first thing that comes to mind is seeking support, right? Finding the loved ones that come and give you what other people might not be able to, whether it is family, friends, right? Sometimes it's finding groups, right? So like while I was at the UFO, I ran a lot of groups on identity, right? And I ran SAHE, which was a group for immigrant, lower SES, Latinx, Black students to come together and share with each other of like, in this week of you will not believe what happened at the U of O, right? And they had a place to come and share with each other and build each other, and where they didn't have to explain any of this. More recently, I've been running a cultural caucus through CU Anschutz School of Medicine, where they are working with the different residents, and I've gotten to work with some of the BIPOC students, and just being refreshed by the fact that they could go somewhere and be like, I don't have to ask you if you believe me if this is true because I know you know it to be true,
Yeah.
right? So the power of community, I think, number one.
Yeah.
Um, within seeking support, when I plug in therapists and psychologists that understand racial trauma, that understand just how to work with BIPOC folks.
Mhm.
Um, Self care comes to mind as something that's important, right? Whether it is meditation, mindfulness, creative expression,
Yeah.
like being able to do that, something that I think our communities are very much proud of, and also becomes a burden that we carry is we're extremely proud of being hard workers, right? And like we give a lot of ourselves, but
Mhm.
joy also needs to be accomplished, right? And we
Mhm.
don't put that on the list, right? So like being able to get that in self-care practices is important. With self-care comes self-compassion, self-reflection.
Yeah.
um, the last, I'll do three more because I know we're tight for time. Setting boundaries, right? Like setting boundaries around who you are and protecting yourself from racial trauma. That means sometimes setting boundaries about what we consume in the news, in Instagram, or whatever it is that we're using. How do we protect ourselves from that? Secondly, setting boundaries around people, that are not good or healthy to us,
Mhm.
right? Like our presence is the most powerful thing we have. So how do we pull out of being around people that are triggering or are toxic or are racist, straight up?
Yeah.
The second thing I'll say is educate yourself, like learning about your history, learning about what does
Mhm.
it mean to be you in this society, and what does it mean to live in the body you live in. And with that comes activism and advocating. I think in a lot of ways, activism, shout out to the UFO critical consciousness, right? Like being able to learn what it is that I'm able to do and taking action through it and seeing change can be empowering. We might not be able to change society, but you might be able to change your community in a way that makes sense.
Mhm.
And that can be powerful. And again, therapists, psychologists, mental health providers, and
Yes.
continue to push for that, especially for our men, right? Like I
Mhm.
think that we don't go into healing spaces as often as we should, and um,
Mhm.
needing a calling for that.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really powerful, everything you said. But something that really stuck with me that I was thinking about was just the comment that you made about how special it is to be in community. Is I trust that I can be honest with you, and that you hear me, and that you see me,
Hmm.
and that I don't feel questioned in that experience, right? And that is, you know, honors the name of your business as well. It's like I see myself in you, right? Like you said, it's
Hmm.
you're the other me, and how powerful that is. And so I don't know if you had connected that as you were saying it, but as I heard it, I was like, that's so, like I think that that's such a beautiful sentiment, and it's, um, that collective when we talk about the I think when it comes to mental health, and I want to make sure I articulate this in the way that I want to. When it comes to mental health, I think one of the most dangerous things is that the isolation that people experience, because that just intensifies the negative, whatever experiences we're having, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological. And so um, how special it is to be able to find that. And it's so hard because people are constantly feeling displaced, are being displaced, and are needing to rebuild. And that's something else that we can go into. But essentially, as we're talking about that with the communities, let's put the emphasis on that. What can communities do, or what can society at large do to support and invalidate the individuals who've experienced the racial trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like one last point to what you were talking
Okay.
about, right, is the cultural connection and affirmation that exists when we come together as community,
Yes.
right? Like we're able to show up fully us,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the amount of times and the amount of places in which we're like, is my hair okay for this space? Like I'm the only brown person in the whole entire building. Like, am I supposed to be here? Right? Like, it changes the moment that you're in community and the beauty of that, the power of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like at large when it comes to society, what can we do? I think the first foremost thing that comes to mind is fostering inclusive and safe spaces, right? Being intentional about creating these spaces where people are able to show up themselves, and also creating spaces that are just for people of color. Right. Like there's ways in which allyship, I want to talk about allyship in a second, but it's important for us to have our own spaces, our own place where we can come and be us fully.
Yeah.
Um, Secondly, listening and validate experiences, right, of racial trauma. So when someone comes in and tells you, oh my gosh, I think this thing happened, often the response from others is, are you sure? Are you exaggerating a little? Maybe you're a little too sensitive, right? And it's kind of like, hold on, what? And you start gaslighting yourself. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
secondary form of trauma, right? Because now you are reliving the whole entire thing and being questioned on your integrity, your honesty, and your lived experience. So the
Mm-hmm.
best thing that we can do there is listen first and then validate the experience. Just because you haven't had it, just because you never experienced it, does not mean that it's not true. And I think it's especially true for white folks, right? When we talk about our white allies, like it's okay that maybe you don't have this lived experience or perspective. You don't need to be a psychologist to be able to show up with someone and say, I believe you, right? And the power of that on its own. Educate and raise awareness, educate others, right? Like do your own work. Also continue to learn from those that are most affected by the things that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when you're able to amplify the voices of marginalized individuals, if there is specific Instagram accounts or websites, or what you're doing here, right? By having first gen professionals come together, like that amplification is taking place, but we'd love to see it from society at large, right? A lot of the times it's like our people helping our people, right? And
We have to build. We have to build. I don't know about you, Dr. Ryan, but my thought was like when I was going into this work, I kept thinking, I'm going to find it. I'm going to find it, and I'm like, you know what? I think we just have to create it, and
Mhm.
and I'm seeing everyone do that, and I think it's so beautiful. Like you're also creating so much community in your space, and yeah, a lot of these micro communities, but I think they're going to grow. I think we're just planting seeds. I think that's all that's happening right now.
I believe it. I believe it. We're planning a whole forest coming behind. Um, I think within those plantings, like how do we change the systems that we're in and that we work within? So challenging systemic racism where you work at in your organization, your school. Are there things that are happening that we could be doing better? And how do
Mm-hmm.
we use that positionality for power, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we live in marginalized identities, but I'm also a doctor at the end of the day. So I have a lot of power in the work that I
Mm-hmm.
do and how I create trouble in the spaces I live. So I think like advocacy, allyship, whatever that might look like, is part of that healing as well. Um, and last but not least, I think cultural competence, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's not going to be enough of us. And when I say us, people of color providing services, which means we need other providers to also step up and be ready to work with racial trauma.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that beautifully said, Dr. Ryan. And I think sometimes people, it's like, oh, when we're talking about systems, everyone's like, oh, that's bigger than me. But it's always just the one. If you change one thing about how you're approaching something, you teach someone else, and they teach someone else, and that ripple effect can be so much bigger than we can ever imagine it. Right? Think about how easily things go viral on social media. Right?
Mhm.
Can we? I was like, can this just go viral? Can we go? You know what I mean? Can you go
Mhm.
viral when you're having these conversations where you're challenging yourself? And I think oftentimes I know that cancel culture is scary, and but and then that makes people sometimes maybe limit themselves. But when find the spaces where you can educate yourself, find the spaces where you can find that community, pay people for their time and expertise to help you. I think the biggest one is, especially pay hire BIPOC professionals who are doing this work. It's like, oh, you want to learn and you want to be in a space where you can be vulnerable, then hire someone to help you do that, right? Like,
Mhm.
especially if you have the resources for that. And then I'm talking to all those big corporations.
Uh-huh.
As June has been officially declared as like Immigrant Heritage Month this year, 2023. Biden declared that, right? July is BIPOC Mental Health Month, right? And the reason that we have these designations, it's like it should be all year round. Let's be honest. Like we should always be aware of the diversity that built and sustains America.
Mhm.
Okay, built and
Back.
sustains our food, our basic needs. That's what that is. But the show is aware of that. But anyway, I was like, I feel like I'm going to go on this whole tirade here, so I'm going to step a little bit
Yeah,
back a
I'm here for it. I'm here for it.
little. But what I think my whole goal with that is, if you're feeling too small, know that you're not. Know that you're not, and know that what you do is powerful. Know that that moment that you pause to listen to that person and to just validate and affirm their existence is more powerful than you know. And I think that's what I want people to think of when they're thinking about, like, oh, I don't think I can really create systemic change with the one thing with by just showing up, or by just it's like, no, show up. It makes a difference, and show up in the ways that you can. Maybe you can't be an ally by actively being a protesting or activist on the streets, but you can educate. You can sit at that dinner table and correct someone one time. You can say, that's not the proper term, or this is not something that I feel comfortable with speaking about at the table. You can shut people down,
Mhm.
and I know it's scary, but that's part of it, right? It's all scary. I do things scared all the time, and Dr. Brian, I'm sure you are in a similar position, but you have to do that, if you really are committed to trying to make any kind of change.
Absolutely. I think a question that often gets thrown around is like, well, what do BIPOC communities and people need for us allies to do,
Hmm.
right? And it's like, well, we need
Show
you
up.
to do the exactly same thing we've always needed, right?
Yeah.
Show up is one of them, right? Well, how do we do that? It's like I cannot tell you how to show up. The question becomes, what are you willing to risk,
Yeah.
right? Like, because at the end of the day, how do you use your positionality for change? How do you use your positionality for equity, right? So I
Yeah.
cannot tell you how to show up as an ally. The question becomes, how much are you willing to risk? Then show up. And I think that's very individualized to each of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, like you said, it's like we can really go down that one. And so I'll be mindful of time. So, Dr. Brian, like I'm always so inspired by everything that you do and how, even since our doctoral program, because, like these programs are so tough. They take up so much of our time and energy. And although, we're there, we want to be there. There's lots of moments of questioning, like, why am I doing this? Right. And I don't know what your why is, but I know my why had always been my community. And it's
Mhm.
always been my nice in my community. It's my family and my community at large. Because like Dr. Brian said earlier, these titles we hold, they do open doors. They do bring us into spaces we normally wouldn't be in. And that's a responsibility that I took upon myself because it was so important, something I was so passionate about. And so I'll let you speak for yourself with that. But because of all of this, I want to know like how we can support you and your work.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I think very similarly, right? Like a lot of us came into this work because we didn't see ourselves reflected in it.
Yeah.
And the reality is that at the end of the day, most of psychology with the colonizer comes back to our ancestral knowledge. Being with each other, being with people is what we do best, right? And you're gonna tell me that's not collectivism, right? Like at the end of the day, it comes from the exact same branch as living through the four agreements, right? Like that comes from Toltec wisdom, right? And bringing all of these different lenses to the clinical work that I do, I think is a way of also reclaiming psychology for all of us, not just for the few. How can you help me? How can we support my work? Go to englishcc.com, check out some of the things that we got going on. This Thursday, we're doing an Honoring the Black Diaspora event through Division 17. Myself and Dr. Laura Minero are going to be talking about how do we honor Blackness and Black identities in clinical work with Latinx communities. Also, if your organization needs a speaker, please do reach out. I'm currently taking clients as well. So you can also reach out to my website for that and providing supervision, right? Like we cannot talk about how do we continue to support clinicians in being culturally sensitive, trauma responsive without being part of the lessons that we give. So multiple ways of helping, reaching out, and anything else. Follow my Insta and say what's up. Would love to hear from you.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're located in Colorado. And so when you mentioned with therapy clients, where are you licensed to be able to see clients from what areas? Because I know
Uh,
Colorado, I think, has a unique.
yeah, absolutely. So I am out of Denver, Colorado. So I can see folks in Colorado, but I'm also something that's called site packed. And when you're site
Mhm.
packed, you actually have access to supporting people from 35 different states. And those include Alabama, Arizona, I'll name a couple of them, Georgia, Illinois, I think Texas, right? Washington, West Virginia, Wisconsin, Wyoming. If you look up setback.com, it'll give you a whole list, but there's 35 different states. We're able to provide services to all 35 of them.
I had no idea it was so many. I didn't realize it had grown so much because California, for those of you who don't know, California is not included in this at this time. I
Hmm.
know that there are advocacy efforts for that. And so I'm just going to link the website really quickly here for folks who want to look into that, psychpack.org. And so if anyone is interested in learning more about the states that are part of that, and so providers, you have access to more providers through that. And so thank you so much. And again, thank you so much, Dr. O'Brien. It was so special to have you here today, and I'm so grateful for you. And I don't know if you would like to share anything with, I guess, the audience before we end today.
No, I think for the most part, just a lot of gratitude to you, a lot of gratitude to folks that are listening in. Um, the only thing that comes to mind right now is wanting to do an English call and response. I don't know how you feel about that. Should we
Oh,
take it for a spin?
yeah, okay, let's try it. Why not? Okay,
All
let's
right.
go. Yeah.
So English comes from Mayan. It's a way of saluting each other, which means you are my other me. Luis Valdez wrote a poem in relation to this, and we do it as a call and response for different spaces. So repeat after me. En la quecha lakin.
En la quecha lakin.
Tú eres mi otro yo.
Tú eres mi otro yo.
You are my other me.
You are my other me.
Si te hago daño a ti,
Si te hago daño a ti,
if I do harm to you,
if I do harm to you,
me hago daño
me hago daño
a mí mismo.
a mí mismo.
I do harm to myself.
I do harm to myself.
Si te amo y respeto,
Si te amo y respeto,
if I love and respect you,
if I love and respect you,
me amo y respeto yo.
me amo y respeto yo.
I love and respect myself.
I love and respect myself.
En la quecha. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. Thank you all for those of you who tuned in live with us. For those of you who maybe are watching the replay, please subscribe to the channel to never miss an episode. Please share with others who may benefit from this. Make sure you check out Dr. Brian's website. Follow him on social media so that you don't miss out on his amazing offerings as well. And as always, these episodes go live every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, really for as long as I can do it because I love doing this work. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.